On the morning of the 25th of August, 1944, Parisians awoke to find the City of Light blanketed by the smoke of battle. After 4 years of relative peace, combat had erupted across the city. A week earlier, on the 19th, hearing of the massive Allied victory in Normandy, elements of the FFI, or French resistance, began seizing dominant positions and buildings across the city. For the better part of a week, the German garrison attempted to recapture these strongpoints, and once more, French and German blood flowed through Paris's picturesque streets. Despite their disadvantage in materiel and firepower, the men and women of the resistance knew that Germany's time in France was short. On the night of the 24th, the lead elements of General Leclerc's Free French 2nd Armoured Division entered the city, and by midday on the 25th, its tanks were rolling down the Champs-Élysées. That afternoon, the German garrison surrendered, and Paris was, once again, free. The Allied victory in Normandy had been utterly decisive. Not only was essentially all of France now liberated, but the vast German armies in the west were now little more than a routed rabble, fleeing desperately for the Reich's borders. On June the 6th, the Wehrmacht deployed no fewer than 59 divisions in France and the Low Countries, the majority of which were concentrated in the Normandy and Pas-de-Calais sectors. Over 20 had been brought to battle in Normandy's Bocage country, a viciously close maze of hedgerows, closed lines of sight, and blind corners. The Normandy campaign was as attritional as any battle of the Second World War. The combination of the extremely constrained battlefield geometry, relatively small front, and vast concentrations of firepower gave the Battle of Normandy its own macabre flavour. Almost a third of the Wehrmacht's vaunted panzer forces had been consumed in the fire, engulfed in the deadly cacophony of Typhoon, B-25, and 17-pounder. Not only had Panzer Group West and the 7th Army been ground to a bloody pulp, but by refusing to commit to an orderly withdrawal, Hitler had transformed an operational defeat into strategic disaster. Even as Patton's Third Army was rampaging across northern France, Hitler ordered the most capable and mobile elements of the 15th Army to move west of the Seine River, a water obstacle which was rapidly being made impassable by Allied air power, making these units ripe targets for envelopment. By doing so, he also crippled the only intact field army in France that was in any position to mount a credible defence. Along with virtually all of the 7th Army and Panzer Group West, these elements were trapped in the massive encirclement on the Seine River, an envelopment facilitated by the destruction of every bridge between Paris and Le Havre. For these units, escape meant abandoning all heavy equipment, including artillery, vehicles, and anti-tank guns. Without these critical weapons and assets, which are essential in modern war, the men who did escape were virtually powerless to oppose Eisenhower's heavily armed, mechanized juggernaut. By the day Paris was liberated, 3 German field armies had been eviscerated by the Western Allies, and the road to the Reich lay wide open. On the 25th of August, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces Intelligence Assessment, abbreviated as SHAEF, concluded. 2.5 months of bitter fighting, culminating for the Germans in a bloodbath big enough for even their extravagant tastes, have brought the end of the war in Europe within sight, almost within reach. The strength of the German armies in the West has been shattered. Paris belongs to France again, and the Allied armies are streaming towards the frontier of the Reich. Before D-Day, SHAEF's planning staff had developed a long-term strategic concept outlining a plausible campaign in France and the Low Countries, which would inevitably occur once the Allied armies had broken out from the Normandy beachhead. SHAEF had assumed that the Allies would hold the line of the Seine River by approximately D+90, or 3 months after D-Day, but concluded that this barrier could not be forced before several deep water ports had been secured in Brittany and Quiberon Bay, and Eisenhower had an army of no fewer than 60 divisions at his disposal. Once this force had been established, the Allies would attack on a broad front, pushing the Germans back to the West Wall. This general outline was later adopted by Eisenhower as his campaign plan. But the combination of superior Allied mobility and disastrous German operational decision-making had rendered much of its assumptions moot. In fact, the victory in Normandy was more complete than any of its planners could have dared to hope. On September the 4th, the day Antwerp fell, Hitler reinstated Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief West. On paper, the force he had inherited from Field Marshal Model was very impressive. In addition to the 59 divisions he had commanded in early June, an additional 13 had been transferred to France from other sectors, bringing the total number of German divisions on the Western Front to 72. But, in Model's estimation, that massive paper army had a real-world frontline strength of just 25 divisions. Such was the scale of German defeat in the French campaign. This tiny force now had to man a front stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Most alarmingly, of the 11 Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions that were deployed to the Normandy front, only 11 Kampfgruppen remained. Unlike the Western Allies, the Germans never motorized their armies. The vast majority of German divisions relied heavily upon rail and horses for operational mobility and logistical support. Indeed, even in 1944, in a typical German line infantry division, 2/3 of its heavy equipment such as artillery and anti-tank guns were horse-drawn. Despite its magnificent panzer divisions, the Wehrmacht was still, at its foundation, a marching army, and thus, in any battle with the completely motorized and mechanized Western Allies, the burden would fall ever more heavily on these highly mobile forces. Consequently, the immolation of Panzer Group West was a disaster of the greatest magnitude, one that appeared fatal. Given the Wehrmacht's limitations, the destruction of approximately 45 German divisions in Normandy and the Seine encirclement had presented the Allies with a golden opportunity. Notwithstanding the truly colossal Soviet forces that loomed across the Eastern Front, in 1944 it was in the West that the Germans faced a truly fatal threat. Despite the utterly ruinous defeat inflicted upon Army Group Center during Operation Bagration, in the East the Germans had the luxury of space. There was nearly 1,500 kilometers between Smolensk and Berlin, but as General Charles de Gaulle entered Paris, the Allies were just 300 kilometers from Germany's industrial heartland. Located in the Westphalian Plain, the Ruhr Valley is the largest urban area in Germany. The wider region contains the industrial cities of Dortmund, Essen, and Duisburg. Blessed with abundant coal reserves, this region became the engine of Germany's industrial revolution, driving an economic development that would propel the Kaiserreich to become one of the world's premier economic powers. In 1944, this small, 3,500 square kilometre corner of the Westphalian Plain produced 51.7% of Germany's hard coal and 50.4% of her crude steel. Even after years of industrial dispersal and diversification, the Ruhr remained the beating heart of the German economy. Many specialized alloys that were essential in tank and aircraft production could be made nowhere else. Without that steel and energy, the Nazi war machine would simply come to a grinding halt. The Ruhr was unquestionably vulnerable now. Despite the existence of the West Wall, von Rundstedt had neither the reserves nor the mobility to counter a concentrated thrust. But as is so often the case in military history, the greatest enemy facing the Western Allies in September 1944 was not the Germans, but the logistics. In something of a technical and technological miracle, throughout the Normandy campaign, the massive, powerful, and fully mechanized 21st Army Group had been supplied across the invasion beaches. Prior to Operation Cobra, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, 1.5 million men, and millions of tons of supplies had poured into Normandy and the Cotentin Peninsula, the vast majority of which landed on the beaches. Operation Overlord was a logistical masterpiece, and the Allied success throughout the Normandy campaign was, in no small part, explained by this logistical victory. In addition to the complex ballet of landing so much material across open beaches, anchorages that were subject to violent North Atlantic storms, ingenious inventions such as the Mulberry Harbours and Pluto, or pipeline under the ocean, had allowed the 21st Army Group to win the Battle of the Build-Up, eventually achieving a decisive force ratio advantage. In the area of logistics, Allied performance in Normandy had been nothing short of masterful. But by early September, the sheer size of the Allied armies that were rampaging across France was simply outstripping this partially improvised logistical system. The Normandy campaign had been fought by a single army group composed of two field armies, the 2nd British and 1st American. These formations had primarily been supplied across the same beaches they landed on, at least until the port of Cherbourg had been captured, cleared, and repaired, a process that took weeks. Even by the last week of July, the port was still so heavily damaged that its logistical throughput had only partially eased the wider supply burden. On the 1st of August, the 21st Army Group was split to accommodate the vast number of Allied divisions that were now pouring into France. All American forces in Normandy, forming the 1st and 3rd Armies, were now placed under the newly mobilized 12th Army Group headquarters, commanded by General Omar Bradley. This meant removing the 1st US Army from 21st Army Group and Field Marshal Montgomery's command, a formation which was replaced by the 1st Canadian Army. On the 15th of August, these 4 field armies were joined by 2 more, the 1st French and 7th American, which came ashore in southern France as part of Operation Dragoon. In fact, by September 1944, the Western Allies had no fewer than 8 field armies deployed on the European continent, across both the Italian and French theatres. But by September, it was becoming apparent that these massive armies were simply outstripping the Western Allies' ability to feed and water them, a problem that was only made more acute by the extremely rapid breakout from Falaise. Patton's Third Army had advanced over 500 kilometres from the Cotentin Peninsula to Dijon, where it made contact with the 7th Army, which was advancing up the Rhone Valley. In the north, the British breakout from Falaise had been almost as rapid. It had taken the 2nd British Army just 4 days to drive from its Seine bridgehead to Belgium, capturing the all-important port of Antwerp before the Germans could destroy it. In fact, this advance was so rapid that British spearheads captured the headquarters of the 7th German Army, including its brand new commander, General de Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach, at Amiens. But as the Allied armies approached the Reich, their attack began to stall. Even as the victorious 30 Corps was rampaging through northern France and Belgium, their supply lines extended some 250 miles back to Bayeux. Despite the rapid breakout in the north, the major ports in the Pas-de-Calais, such as Le Havre, were still in German hands, and thus there was no active port closer than Cherbourg. Those in southern France were hundreds of kilometres from the front, and were thus far only supplying the needs of the 7th Army. Furthermore, given the near-complete destruction of the French rail network, all Allied armies were heavily reliant upon road transportation to meet their daily supply requirements, and all were operating farther from an active railhead than had been anticipated prior to the invasion. Huge stockpiles of materiel had been amassed in Normandy, but moving those supplies forward across a country whose logistical system had been devastated by a half-year-long Allied air campaign was causing massive problems. The drive to Antwerp, which had been conducted by 30 and 12 Corps, was only made possible by keeping 8 Corps and all of Montgomery's heavy artillery and anti-aircraft units west of the Seine, in addition to cutting the 1st Canadian Army's daily supplies substantially. On Montgomery's right flank, Bradley's logistical challenges were even more acute. General Hodge's 1st US Army, which was now operating in the Verdun area, had lines of communication which stretched all the way back to the port of Cherbourg, a distance of over 400 miles. Plus, now the Americans had to feed the city of Paris and its 2.5 million people. The solution Bradley's men found was a typically American feat of practical ingenuity. By simply ignoring more traditional standard operating procedures, such as moving in convoy and driving with lights off, American supply companies were able to massively increase their logistical throughput. Dubbed the Red Ball Express, American trucks drove around the clock in a massive one-way circle that ran from the Cotentin Peninsula right through to the Belgian border. No one was permitted on these roads other than supply companies. By this means, the American Army was able to deliver 7,000 tons a day to the 12th Army Group, which was enough to keep the advance moving. But every mile the Allies moved forward was a mile further their lines of communication ran. This was especially acute on the right flank, where Patton's maniacal advance was pushing the Allied line ever further from its logistical base in Normandy, and away from the Ruhr. It was in exploiting the remarkable Allied victory in Normandy that the shortcomings of Eisenhower's operational plan were becoming apparent. Pushing the Germans back across a broad front was certainly a typically American operational concept. Not only was it a clear path to victory, but it leveraged the aggregate Allied advantage in materiel by emphasizing attrition. By applying pressure everywhere, the Allies would be sure to grind down the Wehrmacht, a military opponent who simply could not match the industrial might of the Western Allies, especially in a heavily attritional campaign. Nevertheless, and despite its fundamental soundness, Eisenhower's operational concept was certainly not able to take full advantage of this period of acute German weakness. For several weeks prior to the breakout from the Seine, Montgomery had been advancing an alternate campaign plan, one in which all of the administrative resources available to the Western Allies would be allocated to the 2nd British and 1st American armies, enabling both to attack on a narrow, 50-mile wide front. This powerful force would advance along the Paris, Amiens, Brussels, Cologne axis, with Antwerp on their left flank and the Ardennes on their right. This concentrated thrust, Montgomery argued, would simply be unstoppable, especially given the state of the forces opposing them. The Ruhr was within reach. However, in order to achieve this, Patton's victorious Third Army would have to be halted and virtually all of its supplies diverted to Hodge's First Army. When Montgomery first put this plan to Eisenhower in late August, the American replied that stopping Patton in the middle of a historic advance would simply be impossible on political grounds. The American people would simply not stand for it. The case for the narrow front attack only grew with the fall of Antwerp. The British advance had been so rapid that it had effectively created a gap between the 15th German Army, which was pinned in a large pocket along the coast, and what remained of the badly mauled 7th. The 15th Army could still escape through the heavily fortified Scheldt estuary. However, doing so would not only take weeks, but also mean abandoning most of their precious equipment. The gap between the two German armies was now over 50 miles wide, and all Field Marshal Model had available to fill it was one low-grade static infantry division, which had been manning the Atlantic Wall defences in Holland, one badly shattered division, which had fought in Normandy, and a hodgepodge of other small units, such as a brigade of Dutch SS. On September the 4th, Model reported to Hitler's headquarters that if Army Group B were to effectively hold a line stretching along the Albert Canal, Meuse River and West Wall defences, this line must be manned by 25 fresh infantry divisions and an adequate mobile reserve of 5 to 6 panzer divisions. Otherwise, the gateway to Germany will be wide open. But Model may as well have asked for a Constitution-class starship. In all of Germany, not one fresh division could be found. In the last weeks of August, every single spare division in the entire Wehrmacht, 7 in all, had been sent to the upper Moselle Valley to halt Patton. The only other reserve were the remnants of 10 panzer divisions which had been decimated by the Red Army and were now being reformed as brigades, each one fielding a single panzer battalion accompanied by a panzer grenadier battalion, roughly 1/3 the nominal strength of a panzer division. Things were so desperate in September that the Wehrmacht began to cannibalize itself. The 4 Werkkreise, or military districts, in Western Germany were ordered to organize their depot staff into a division headquarters and mobilize every man they could find. These included ordnance and training staff, an act of desperation that would badly inhibit the flow of trained replacements. It was at this moment of utter desperation that salvation arrived in the unlikely form of Hermann Goering. He reported to OKW that the Luftwaffe had some 6 regiments of paratroopers that were in various stages of retraining or re-equipping, and 2 more that could be generated by mobilizing convalescents. Of these 20,000 well-trained paratroopers could be added another 10,000 personnel from various other Luftwaffe units which had been grounded due to a lack of fuel. All of these men were young, fit, and ideologically motivated. This force formed the core of the 1st Parachute Army, commanded by a pioneer of airborne operations, General Kurt Student. He was ordered to deploy this force into Holland and close the gap between the 15th and 7th Armies. But even with this respite, the German position was desperate. After assuming command, von Rundstedt reported that he required approximately 2,000 tanks to make good his losses. In all of Army Group B, there were only 150 armoured fighting vehicles operational. Opposing this shattered German army was a massive concentration of combat power. In Belgium, facing the now gaping hole between the 15th and 7th armies, was a force of 8 armoured divisions and 2 independent armoured brigades, an army that was directly supported by several Allied tactical air forces which were operating from southern England. Montgomery was adamant that this opportunity would not present itself in perpetuity. He requested several times that offensive operations in other sectors be halted to allow for a concentrated drive through Belgium towards Cologne. Eisenhower agreed in principle, but did not see the need to halt other operations, a conclusion Montgomery argued was simply because of how disconnected Ike was from the battle. Things came to a head between the two men on the morning of September the 10th, when Montgomery met Eisenhower's plane at a Brussels airfield. The meeting got off to an inauspicious start when Montgomery requested that Eisenhower's chief administrative officer leave them, whilst keeping his own aide present. Then, after producing a written account of the communication between the two headquarters, Montgomery tore into Eisenhower in what can only be described as an acrimonious, insubordinate tirade, explaining, in excruciating detail, exactly what he thought of Eisenhower's campaign plan. A measure of his quality as a general and a leader. Despite the tirade's growing fury, as opposed to responding in anger, Eisenhower simply sat there and absorbed the abuse. When the diatribe paused for a moment, Eisenhower leant forward, put his hand on Montgomery's knee, and said in a quiet but firm voice, "Steady, Monty. I'm your boss. You can't speak to me like that." Few other men would have tolerated this insubordination with such grace. This moment of balance and calmness immediately cut through the acrimony. Montgomery replied, "I'm sorry, Ike," and then proceeded to make his case respectfully. The following discussion was cordial but passionate. Montgomery continued to advocate strongly for a narrow front approach, emphasizing the logistical challenges and the opportunity which may well evaporate in the coming weeks. But despite its passion, this argument was unable to move Eisenhower. Ike simply did not see the need to gamble on a narrow front. Attacking on a broad front was a far more certain path to victory, and would actually make use of the massive Allied armies which were now in the field. Although it might take an operational pause to allow for the development of the French ports, this had always been part of the plan, and, in any case, if the Germans were in as dire a position as many believed, they might yet collapse under the pressure of a broad front advance. Montgomery thought these arguments to be fallacious. With such comparatively meagre logistical assets available, attacking everywhere would inevitably mean attacking nowhere, as even if a breakthrough were achieved somewhere, none of the main Allied armies would have enough supply to advance deeply into Germany. But, try as he might, he could not move his American superior. Montgomery's attitude and his haughty and entitled treatment of his American allies did little to help his case. The argument that Monty should be reinstated as Supreme Land Force Commander to oversee this narrow front attack made Bradley and the other American generals skeptical, and the passion with which he advanced this concept raised questions as to his motives. With the growing American dominance of the forces in France, perhaps the great British general was becoming uncomfortable with his diminishing role within the campaign. None of the Americans wished to be commanded by a British general again, especially as they were now clearly the leading partner in the Western Alliance. But, in truth, Montgomery was under intense political pressure. The United Kingdom was facing financial ruin. The cost of the war was sending London bankrupt, and there was real concern that Britain could not financially sustain the war effort for another year, at least without imposing financial ruin upon itself. Thus, ending the war in 1944 was a critical priority for the British, far more so than their American allies, who faced no such financial pressure. Having failed to change Eisenhower's position, Montgomery was able to achieve something of a consolation prize. For well over a month now, the Allied generals had been looking for an opportunity to employ their primary strategic reserve, the 1st Allied Airborne Army. After their critical role in Operation Overlord, the Allied airborne forces had been withdrawn to England to regroup. By August, they were back at full strength and ready to be deployed. Eisenhower had hoped to use this force to achieve some decisive effect. Half a dozen plans had been made to employ these units after the breakout, but every time each concept had been developed, the Allied tanks had overrun the proposed landing zones. In early September, Eisenhower had proposed that the 3 airborne divisions should be dropped in the front of the 1st US Army in the Maastricht-Aachen area to cut a hole in the Siegfried Line, but this was rejected by Bradley, who had little faith in airborne forces. But, with his hopes of a narrow front assault dashed, Montgomery now turned to this one strategic reserve. He proposed that these airborne forces be used in the northern sector to outflank the majority of the West Wall defences. In Holland, the primary obstacles were the numerous water crossings that were required to access the Rhine. However, once that final barrier was taken, the 2nd British Army would have essentially outflanked the West Wall and established itself on the North German plain. From this position, there would be no more natural obstacles or fixed defensive lines to prevent the manoeuvre of British and Canadian heavy forces or an envelopment of the Ruhr. This plan was both imaginative and bold. In fact, for Montgomery, it was uncharacteristically risky. If it worked, it held some realistic promise of taking the Ruhr before the onset of winter and potentially bringing the war to a close in 1944. But the now named Operation Market Garden was fraught with risk. In order to achieve its wider strategic purpose, crossing the Rhine, the 3 airborne divisions would have to be deployed in depth, forming a carpet some 50 miles deep. This made the last of the 3, the British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem, the most vulnerable. It was so far from the British front line that any delay in 30 Corps' advance would leave the formation exceedingly vulnerable to counterattack, especially by German heavy forces. But with so much on the line, including the future of the United Kingdom as a great imperial power, Montgomery decided that it was worth the risk. D-Day was set for September the 17th, 1944. Operation Market Garden, the most ambitious airborne operation in military history, opened with an astounding display of air power. A full-strength airborne corps was dropped across central Holland. The 101st Airborne Division was tasked with securing several minor river crossings at the city of Eindhoven. The 82nd Airborne was headed for Nijmegen and its bridges over the Maas and Waal rivers. Finally, the British 1st Airborne had been given the task of taking the crown jewel, the Rhine crossing at Arnhem. 1,073 troop transports and 478 gliders conveyed 3 airborne divisions to their drop zones, a force that was supported by no fewer than 1,113 medium bombers and 1,452 fighters. In total, over 4,600 aircraft were employed on the opening day of Operation Market Garden, and of that number, only 76 were shot down. But despite this overwhelming display of technological and material superiority, from its very opening moments, the operation began to unravel. General Kurt Student, the commander of the newly arrived 1st Parachute Army, was sitting at his desk in the village of Vort, 8 miles from an American LZ. Driven outside by the tremendous noise, Student was greeted by the sight of hundreds of aircraft and gliders flying just a few thousand feet overhead. "Oh, how I wish I had ever had such powerful means at my disposal," he remarked later. Field Marshal Model also had a ringside seat to the operation. He was having a briefing at his tactical HQ on the edge of Arnhem when British paratroopers began raining down around him. He literally drove between the landing zones on his way to take personal command of the Arnhem garrison before calling in reinforcements in the form of the badly depleted, but still formidable, 9th SS Panzer Division, which was stationed just to the south. By the early afternoon, an American glider had been shot down close to Vort, and within hours, General Student had a complete set of Allied orders sitting on his desk. German reserves were certainly meagre, but with the 2 most important commanders so well situated, and now armed with a good intelligence picture of the operation, the Germans were well disposed to react effectively. As an operational concept, Market Garden had 2 primary weaknesses. The first was the selection of the landing zones around Arnhem, which were some 8 miles from the 1st Airborne Division's objective, the bridges over the lower Rhine. These were selected because it was not possible to deploy the division in one movement, and the need for secure LZs was emphasized over proximity to the division's objectives. Thus, this distance gave the Germans a small window of opportunity to prevent large British forces from entering the town. Model's moment of inspired leadership did just that. He personally commanded a Kampfgruppe of the 9th SS Panzer, which took up blocking positions to the north of Oosterbeek. Although few in number, the German armour was difficult to deal with for the lightly armed paratroopers, and thus this one battle group effectively interdicted the entire 1st Parachute Brigade, preventing it from reaching Arnhem. In all, just the 2nd Parachute Battalion and a smattering of other elements, a force of around 500 men, actually secured the northern end of the road bridge in Arnhem itself. However, the southern end was firmly held by a company of SS. The unexpectedly rapid German reaction had exploited a key weakness in the plan, and throughout the rest of the battle, the majority of the division was unable to reinforce this lone battalion and secure the bridge. The other major problem with Operation Market Garden was the primary axis of attack. Their lack of mechanization, armor, and heavy weapons made airborne divisions exceedingly vulnerable, especially to heavy units such as panzer forces. Thus, it was imperative that the 3 airborne divisions be rapidly reinforced by Allied armor. This relief force, 30 Corps, was spearheaded by the large and powerful Guards Armored Division. However, its axis of attack and only ground line of communication was the narrow Highway 69, a road which was often surrounded by impassable, soft ground. The requirement for speed meant that supporting attacks on the flanks were not possible, and thus throughout the battle, German pockets remained on either side of this main road. All of this conspired to slow down 30 Corps' advance, a set of problems compounded by the inability of the 82nd Airborne to capture both sides of the Waal Bridge at Nijmegen, necessitating a contested river crossing with the support of the Guards Armoured Division. After a week of heavy fighting, it was clear that 30 Corps was unable to break through to Arnhem, and the remnants of the 1st Airborne Division were ordered to retreat across the Rhine, a movement conducted on the night of the 25th of September. They left 8,838 men behind, with 1,984 killed and 6,854 captured. Despite its initial promise, Market Garden had ended in disaster. The failure of Operation Market Garden ended any hope of an Allied victory in 1944. All across the front, the rapid advance stalled as the supply situation became acute. Both Patton's Third Army and a corps of the First Army were literally stopped for periods of up to a week for lack of fuel. On September the 22nd, Eisenhower held a conference at Versailles to discuss Allied operational strategy. It was attended by no fewer than 21 generals, although the most conspicuous absence was Field Marshal Montgomery, who, to much chagrin, sent his chief of staff to represent him. At this conference, Eisenhower's broad front approach was once again reaffirmed. Although the main effort would be in the north, with the aim of enveloping the Ruhr through the North German Plain, 21st Army Group's immediate objective was now switched to opening up the major ports, especially Antwerp, which was closed by heavy German fortifications in the Scheldt estuary. Having a port so much closer to the front would alleviate the need to move supplies from the massive dumps in Normandy, and thus any drive across the lower Rhine would now only be attempted once these ports had been opened. Given how challenging this task was, especially taking heavily fortified islands such as Walcheren, Eisenhower decided to shift US forces north, relieving a corps of the 2nd British Army to the north of Aachen. As September turned into October, it was clear that the victorious and rampaging Allied offensive had culminated. Eisenhower now had 52 divisions in France, but because he had extended his right wing all the way to the Swiss border, he now had a front of over 600 miles to cover. Each Allied divisional frontage was now some 10 miles, leaving the line thin in many places. Several Allied corps were still in northern France, immobilized by a lack of transportation. The advance had simply outstripped its own logistical base. There were still dozens of American divisions waiting to be deployed, but the lack of palletized port facilities in France, which could handle crates, was forcing them to land in England first. The wide-scale operational pause was a godsend for the Wehrmacht. Indeed, the German recovery in the last quarter of 1944 was nothing short of miraculous. During the months of June, July, and August, the Wehrmacht had sustained losses of 1,210,600 dead, wounded, and missing, 2/3 of which occurred on the Eastern Front. To this frightful number can be added 254,225 horses, which were still vital in providing German infantry divisions with logistical support and mobility. Despite its losses, Germany still had colossal forces in the field. Not counting paper divisions which had no personnel, the Wehrmacht's total order of battle included no fewer than 252 divisions and 20 independent brigades. To these could be added some 55 Allied divisions, all of which were operating on the Eastern Front. More than 7,500,000 men in all. With such a vast level of mobilization and conflict raging across 3 fronts, the notion that Germany was even capable of generating any new units of meaningful value may have seemed far-fetched. But even in this dark hour, not all of the Reich's vast military potential had been tapped. Even as the 1st Parachute Army was thwarting Montgomery around Arnhem, Hitler was in the middle of generating significant new forces which would completely change the strategic balance on the Western Front. Although Model complained to von Rundstedt that throughout August and September, replacements were only 10% of his losses, In the Reich, new divisions were being rapidly formed. The most important innovation was the development of the Volksgrenadier Division. Over the prior 18 months, there had been a tendency to reduce the personnel footprint of German infantry divisions whilst simultaneously increasing their firepower. In early 1944, the Standard Infantry Division had been formally reduced from about 17,000 men to 12,500, but the new pattern formation reduced this level of manpower further. Each of the Volksgrenadier Division's 3 infantry regiments were reduced in strength from 3 to 2 battalions, and their organic service battalions were heavily emaciated. This reduced their personnel requirement to 10,000. To compensate, each of the new divisions were allocated a greater number of assault guns and artillery, although delivery of these arms was dependent upon domestic production meeting the immense demand. Logistics and mobility would be provided by horses, although a single battalion was equipped with bicycles. Apart from a solid core of veterans from the Eastern Front, these new formations were manned by a motley crew of children who were just reaching a now reduced military age of 16, convalescents who were recovering in hospital, previously exempt industrial workers, and various personnel from the Luftwaffe or Kriegsmarine. In all, by tapping these reserves, Himmler was able to produce a further 500,000 recruits in September and October, but in doing so, industrial production and training were badly disrupted. In something of a miracle of improvisation and mobilization, by scouring Germany for any able-bodied man, 25 of these new divisions were generated, all of which would be dispatched to the Western Front within weeks. The first echelon were made available to Field Marshal von Rundstedt on October the 1st. To make up for their comparative lack of firepower, the new Volksgrenadier divisions were supported by 12 motorized artillery brigades with a combined strength of 1,000 guns, 10 rocket artillery brigades, 10 assault gun battalions, and 12 20mm machine gun battalions. Although tank production was being badly disrupted by the strategic bombing campaign, the majority of assault gun production was located in relatively safe Czechoslovakia. 766 75mm Stugs rolled off the production line in August, which rose to 1,199 in November. Mobile reserves were to be provided by 10 new model panzer brigades, which were the remnants of panzer divisions which had been decimated on the Eastern Front. These new, smaller, lighter formations contained a single heavy tank battalion deploying 40 Panzer Mark V, or Panther, tanks, and a battalion of Panzer Grenadiers, or mechanized infantry. These new brigades were little more than overstrength Kampfgruppen, approximately one-third the strength of a typical panzer division. Nevertheless, it was hoped that the technological edge the Panther enjoyed over the Sherman would offset the vast numerical superiority enjoyed by the Western Allies. There was one final element of this new army which was being sent west: the formation of 100 fortress infantry battalions, which were specifically designed to man fixed defences. These were staffed with low-quality personnel who were deemed unfit for line infantry deployment. Each of these fortress battalions were provided with very little logistical support beyond bicycles, being allocated just 16 horses compared to a regular infantry battalion's 131. Personnel strength was also reduced, with each battalion only fielding 3 companies. One bicycle company, designed to provide reconnaissance and act as a local reserve. One standard rifle company, a platoon of which was equipped with the new model STG-44 assault rifle, and a weapons company that was armed with 6 MG-42s and 12 8cm mortars. This extra allotment of mortars and machine guns was designed to give the enemy the impression that each of these fortress infantry battalions was a much larger formation. This followed the late war German trend of emphasizing weapons over personnel in their infantry units. All of these 100 battalions, equivalent to 11 line infantry divisions, were sent west. As these battalions were deployed directly by Obi West, as opposed to the various field army headquarters, they represented a hidden reserve, which was not immediately evident to the Western Allies. Although the Reich faced many critical shortages, especially oil, the fact that the Wehrmacht was able to arm these new formations at all was another miracle of mobilization. Despite the immense conflicts being waged across 3 fronts in Italy, France, and the colossal war with the Soviet Union, Germany had never completely mobilized its peacetime economy. With practically all of the industrial resources of continental Europe, in addition to millions of slave laborers from the East, Hitler was able to maintain and support a force of over 300 divisions, including Germany's allies, while still allocating a substantial amount of domestic production to consumer goods. Despite the disastrous defeats incurred in both East and West, conflagrations that consumed men and equipment at a practically unimaginable rate, and the heaviest strategic bombing campaign of the war, there still remained a large amount of slack in the German economy. Albert Speer, Hitler's armament minister, was able to absorb much of the immense damage done to Germany's industrial capacity by implementing a number of measures that, although eroded the long-term health of the German economy, improved production in the short term. Strategic bombing had compelled Speer to utilize a dispersed manufacturing model, which relied heavily on prefabrication, but heavy attacks on the rail network badly disrupted this system. He was only able to keep industry working at full pace by consuming raw materials that were in the pipeline, a massive program of rationalization, working the Reich's slave labor pool to bloody exhaustion, and finally by reducing civilian consumer goods production to a bare minimum. Through these means, Speer was able to maintain, and in some cases even increase, armament production throughout the last half of 1944. For example, rifle production stood at 249,080 in July, and despite a fall of nearly 50% in September, by November, Germany produced over 213,000. Production of machine guns, anti-tank guns, mortars, and infantry guns actually increased over this period, and ammunition stood steady at approximately 300,000 tons per month. The only major arm whose production dropped in late 1944 was tanks. In the month of June, Tiger production stood at 106 units, but due to a series of raids by the US 8th Air Force on the factory in Kessel, that number dropped to just 36 in November. Despite Germany's dire strategic circumstances, the unwillingness of Hitler to impose too much on the German people had given him an unexpected economic reserve, one that gave the Wehrmacht a last breath of life in late 1944. Through these utterly desperate measures, in September, Hitler was able to scrape together some 135,000 men with which to man the West Wall, but given their complete lack of mobility and firepower, these forces would be unable to conduct any kind of meaningful mobile campaign. But luckily, at least on paper, the Germans had just such a defensive belt, a position known to the Americans as the Siegfried Line. In Germany, it was called the West Wall. Construction of a defensive line on Germany's western border began in earnest in 1936 after the remilitarization of the Rhineland. Originally intended to act as Germany's equivalent of the Maginot Line, the initial belt of fortifications ran opposite to its much more famous French cousin, along the line of the Saar River. However, with escalating tensions in 1938, the line was massively extended, eventually stretching from the Swiss border to the Dutch lowlands. Dr. Fritz Todd was tasked with its development. Todd was an able engineer who had supervised the construction of the Autobahn. By the end of September 1938, he had over 500,000 men working on the West Wall, a project that consumed approximately 1/3 of Germany's total annual cement production. When completed in 1940, the line stretched from the area north of Aachen to the Rhine and then along the river's course to the Swiss border. It contained over 3,000 concrete emplacements. Over and above its operational value as a defensive position, the West Wall was of great use as a propaganda tool. Its existence aided in bluffing the Anglo-French delegation at Munich and soothed the concerns of a worried German people as the Wehrmacht committed virtually all of its strength against Poland in 1939. Unlike the much more famous French counterpart, the Maginot Line, which was a thin line of massive, self-contained fortresses, the West Wall was a belt of thousands of interconnecting bunkers and pillboxes. The majority of these positions were approximately the size of an apartment, 20 to 30 feet in width, 40 to 50 in depth, and 20 feet high, although approximately half of the bunker was underground. The roof and walls were between 3 and 8 feet thick steel reinforced concrete. Some of these positions were strengthened by steel beams. Each pillbox had a small living area for its crew of approximately 7 to 10 men, about a single rifle section. Most had several rooms, one or more for garrison quarters, and others for either ammunition storage or firing. All were gas-proof and equipped with hand-operated ventilation devices. Few had more than 2 firing embraces, although one was always sited to cover the door. Although the arcs of fire were typically quite narrow, usually less than 50 degrees, each pillbox was covered by another, and thus they formed a deep web of interlocking fields of machine gun and anti-tank gun fire. These lines were, at times, several thousand meters deep. Across large stretches of the West Wall, these bunkers covered rows of tank obstacles such as Dragon's Teeth, with positions sited approximately 200 to 400 meters behind these defenses. Apart from the thinly developed area around Geilenkirchen, the density of bunkers and pillboxes averaged approximately 10 per mile, or 1 every 150 meters. This ensured each was covered by at least one other position. The strongest portion of the line was the segment constructed in 1936 along the Saar River between the Moselle and the Rhine. After that, the next strongest portion was a double band of defences protecting the Aachen Gap, the traditional invasion route leading into Germany. The extreme northern segment of the West Wall, from Geilenkirchen, about 15 miles north of Aachen, to Cleve, consisted only of a thin, single belt of scattered pillboxes backing up natural obstacles. South of Geilenkirchen, the pillboxes began to appear in a definite pattern of clusters on a forward line backed up by occasional groups a few hundred meters to the rear. At a point about halfway between Geilenkirchen and Aachen, the density of the pillboxes increased significantly, and the line split into two bands about 5 miles apart. The major city of Aachen lay in between the two. At a point near the northern end of the Schnee Eifel, the heavily forested national park, the two bands merged to continue all the way south to Trier as a single line with pillboxes in medium to heavy density. The greatest concentration in the Eifel was near the southern end of the Schnee Eifel, where the terrain is relatively open. Even at its inception in the late 1930s, the West Wall was never designed to be impregnable. Rather, its objective was to slow down any penetration in order to allow mobile reserves to counterattack. In 1940, there were over 100 divisions facing the French, allowing an average divisional frontage of 5 miles. These vast forces were also supported by thousands of artillery tubes, which would concentrate their fire on any breakthrough. None of that was true in 1944. Although work had conducted up until the fall of France, once the western defences had been pushed to the Atlantic, the West Wall had been abandoned. Many of its positions had been left to nature, and some were so overgrown that they could not be identified by Allied reconnaissance. Although many bunkers had been electrified and provided with dedicated communications, given the dilapidated state of these positions, this was unlikely for most. In 1938, the standard crew-served weapons were the MG-34 general-purpose machine gun and PaK-36 37mm anti-tank gun, and many bunkers had been built to house these weapons specifically. Although the MG-34 was still absolutely a viable weapon in 1944, it had largely been replaced by the MG-42 in frontline service, and employing the newer weapon posed some difficulties. But it was in the area of anti-tank artillery that the war had dramatically changed. By 1944, the PaK-36 was utterly obsolete, and the most prolific anti-tank guns of the day, such as the 75mm PaK-40, were far too large to be employed in many West Wall positions. Furthermore, a line like this was designed to rely upon mobile reserves, and in the fall of 1944, there were none. When the exhausted men of the 7th Army finally reached the supposed safety of the West Wall fortifications, they found a dilapidated ruin, one without minefields, barbed wire, or other field fortifications. Thus, this defensive line could hardly be considered unbreakable. Nonetheless, and despite its many deficiencies, the West Wall's existence certainly made the German border far more defensible, and as the Americans were about to find out, steel and concrete can provide even the lowest quality soldiers with a backbone. It was Hodge's 1st US Army that first made contact with the West Wall in early September. Strung out on the march through Belgium, 12th Army Group was not approaching the German frontier in strength, but its lead elements were desperately racing to reach the defensive line before it could be manned. Their primary opponent in the Aachen sector, the 1st SS Panzer Corps under General der Waffen-SS George Kepler, was so depleted that its 4 divisions had now been folded into 2, the 2nd SS Panzer and 2nd Panzer Divisions. When it reached the West Wall, the mighty 2nd SS Panzer Corps amounted to no more than 3 nominal Panzer Grenadier regiments, each with the strength of a reinforced battalion, a few support battalions of pioneers and a smattering of other garrison troops. It had just 6 tanks operational across the entire Corps front, 3 in each division. But despite this weakness, when the lead elements of the 5th Corps made contact with the West Wall in the Schnee Eifel, they were stopped cold. Eventually, the 28th Division was able to create a small, vulnerable salient in the defences, but their advance was limited. 7th Corps was able to penetrate the first belt of obstacles in the Aachen Gap to the south of the city, But when the Americans attempted to bypass Aachen and breach the second line around Stolberg, they were thwarted by a timely German reinforcement. A counterattack by the fresh 12th Infantry Division on the 3rd Armoured Division's Combat Command B rescued a desperate situation, and for a moment had the thinly stretched Americans reeling. With this new and far more serious resistance encountered in the Aachen Gap, it was clear to 1st Army Command that they lacked the strength or supplies to breach the West Wall, and thus the 7th Corps Commander, General Collins, ordered an operational pause. This left his formation in a precarious position. His divisions had penetrated the first line of West Wall defences in some places, partially breached it in others, and in some areas had been held firm. German defensive victories at Arnhem, the Scheldt Estuary and Aachen were a clear sign that, by the 1st of October, not only had the Allied breakout culminated, but the Wehrmacht had recovered and regained some sort of operational balance. On October the 18th, Eisenhower once again conferred with his army group commanders to reassess Allied operational strategy. It was now evident that the moment of German weakness had passed, and with it the opportunity for a quick and decisive strategic victory. Montgomery made his now all too familiar argument for a concentrated attack on the Ruhr, which would mean halting Patton and diverting his supplies north. Eisenhower agreed that the Allies should make one more attempt to take the Ruhr before the onset of winter largely brought a halt to offensive operations. He also agreed that this was a job for 2 armies under the command of 1 man, but decided that said general should be Bradley. The Rhineland offensive would be spearheaded by the 1st and newly arrived 9th US Armies, commanded by General Courtney Hodges and General William Simpson respectively. They were to be supported in the north by the 2nd British Army, now under the command of General Miles Dempsey, which would launch an attack from the Peel Marshes, again once the Scheldt Estuary had been cleared. With the front now clearly stabilising, and the logistical challenges hobbling any hope of launching a truly large-scale offensive in the autumn, Eisenhower revised the primary immediate operational objective to gaining the length of the Rhine River, the last major natural obstacle between the Allies and the West German heartland. This operational concept was a good fit for Eisenhower's wider broad front strategy, as gaining the line of the Rhine along its length would then set the foundation for a larger general offensive which would take the Allies into the Ruhr and beyond. However, given their substantial logistical constraints, such an offensive may now have to wait until the spring brought better campaigning weather, a critical consideration for an Allied army that relied so heavily upon air power. General Bradley's 12th Army Group faced a series of tough challenges. The first was the West Wall itself, which was particularly strong in the Aachen area. Beyond the first line of defences sat the city of Aachen, the traditional gateway to Germany. To its immediate south stretched the great wilderness of the Hurtgen forest and Schnee Eifel, a heavily wooded area that ran through to the much more famous Ardennes. Finally, behind these natural and artificial obstacles sits the Roer River, an upper tributary of the Meuse. Any advance to the Rhine through the Aachen Gap required a crossing of this water obstacle. Just behind the city of Aachen, near the Hurtgen forest, the Roer had been dammed in several places. Allied command was concerned that any advance across the Roer would be impossible until the dams themselves had either been destroyed or captured. If the Germans destroyed these dams, the Roer River valley would be flooded for approximately 1 week. This would not only destroy the bridges across the river, but any unit that may have established a bridgehead would be isolated by the floodwaters, leaving them vulnerable to a concentrated counterattack. During October, the Royal Air Force tried in vain to destroy the dams, but they were so stoutly built that they simply shrugged off the heavy bombs. Thus, after Aachen and the outer West Wall defences, Bradley's third objective was the Roer dams. Once these 3 had been captured, the Rhineland as a whole could be cleared. Bradley's first objective was the city of Aachen. Sandwiched between the wilderness of the Eifel and Ardennes to the south, the border of which was more political than geographic, and the high ground to the north, the Aachen Gap had, for centuries, been a traditional invasion route into Germany. Despite its small size, Aachen was also a target of real symbolic value. Not only was it the first German city to face capture, Aachen was the ancient capital of the Holy Roman Empire, the First Reich. Despite the weakness of German forces in this sector, experience had already shown how formidable the West Wall defences were in the Aachen area. Thus, in order to allow General Hodges to concentrate his forces, Bradley deployed the 9th Army to the Eifel-Ardennes sector. Facing the Americans in Aachen was a brand new formation, General Friedrich Koechling's 81st Corps. Von Rundstedt had used the precious 3 weeks respite to relieve the beleaguered 2nd SS Panzer Corps, allowing the battered remnants of 5 panzer divisions to withdraw back to Germany to rearm and refit. The 81st Corps deployed 4 divisional headquarters. The 183rd and 246th Volksgrenadier divisions, which were at full strength but were mostly staffed with barely trained men, and the understrength 12th and 49th Infantry divisions. Hodge's plan for the battle involved a pincer attack spearheaded by 2 infantry divisions, the 1st and 30th, which would be supported by several other formations, including the 2nd and 3rd Armoured divisions, which were to exploit any breakthrough. The attack's primary objective was to breach the west wall defences to the west of Aachen and then envelop the city, avoiding urban combat if possible. The 30th Infantry Division's attack began on the 2nd of October. Breaching the west wall defences was perhaps more reminiscent of engaging Japanese bunker complexes in the Pacific than the dashing armoured thrusts that had typified much of the combat in France. As they entered the main belt of defences, each pillbox had to be engaged by its own set-piece attack. Under the cover of a heavy artillery bombardment, infantry and engineers would have to assault and envelop each position, requiring a careful and deliberate approach. Even with overwhelming artillery and air support, it took at least half an hour to clear a single fighting position, and more often than not, when a bunker had been successfully taken, the Germans launched a counterattack. Hard fighting had not been expected from an enemy that many thought already beaten, and as the attack developed, the Americans were surprised by the determined resistance. Not only was each bunker fiercely held, but on several occasions bridgeheads and breaches were lost to determined German counterattacks. Perhaps one of the most serious developed on the 8th of October. By that point, the 30th Division had cleared a substantial portion of the defensive line, and in a desperate attempt to plug the gap, the Wehrmacht launched a vicious counterattack on the town of Alsdorf. This assault was made in brigade strength. In total, an infantry regiment, the 1st Assault Battalion, and a Kampfgruppe of the 108th Panzer Brigade, including over 40 tanks and armoured fighting vehicles, advanced towards the town. The attack was only driven off after some very heavy fighting and the commitment of an entire medium tank battalion. The Southern Pincer launched its offensive on the 8th of October. The 1st Division's attack was, perhaps, a little better prepared than the 30th. When the assault regiments left their fighting positions, they did so under the cover of a terrifying artillery bombardment. They were also better able to employ tank infantry tactics to more successfully engage the fixed defences. Within 2 days, the 1st Division had taken its primary objectives: the town of Vellottenheide and Hill 321, which was a dominating terrain feature in the Aachen area. The Germans counterattacked here too, but most of these were broken up by heavy and accurate artillery fire. Despite the heavy fighting and mounting casualties, with American forces now poised to completely envelop the city, Model committed his reserves, the 1st SS Panzer Corps. Hill 231 was the scene of some of the most intense fighting in the Battle of Aachen. This position dominated the city below and allowed the Americans to complete the encirclement. Consequently, Model ordered several counterattacks aimed at recapturing this dominating feature. One of the fiercest was conducted by the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division. That morning, General Denkert directed his division to make a pair of converging thrusts on Hill 231. Making the main effort, the 29th Panzer Grenadier Regiment manoeuvred north, skirting a forested area east of Vellottenheide. It was supported by the 506th Tank Battalion and its 15 Tiger tanks. This manoeuvre was supported by a convergent attack made by the 8th Panzer Grenadier Regiment on the flank along the Aachen-Düren Railroad east of Eilendorf. These two pincers converged on a lone infantry battalion of the 16th Infantry Regiment, which stood little chance of withstanding this massed divisional attack, one reasonably well supported by heavy tanks. But once the Germans left the cover of the tree line, they were greeted by the full fury of American firepower. Between the high ground and the forest was an area of flat, open terrain, all of which had been pre-sighted. As the Grenadiers advanced into this artillery kill zone, they were hammered by the massed fire of some 6 field artillery battalions. Watching this awesome display firsthand, General Denkert later remarked that an advance through this fire was impossible. It was equally impossible to feed the attack from the rear, to move up reserves or ammunition. But little did he know that this attack was more successful than first thought. The massive artillery fire stopped the dismounted German infantry in their tracks. However, the Tiger tanks ploughed on until they reached the American line. They simply drove over several of the 16th Infantry's foxholes, and a vicious, close-range fight ensued. Had these tanks been adequately supported by infantry, it's almost certain that the 16th Infantry Regiment would have broken. But with such overwhelming fire support acting as a force multiplier, Modell's major counterstroke was stopped in its tracks. With Aachen now completely enveloped, the task of reducing the city fell to the 1st Infantry Division. However, with its forces spread thinly holding the line of encirclement, General Hübner, the divisional commander, actually had less men available to attack than the Germans had garrisoning the city. Just 2 battalions of the 26th Infantry Regiment, which had not yet been committed to battle. Facing them were approximately 5,000 Germans, most of which were members of the 246th Volksgrenadier Division, at that time commanded by Colonel Wilk. Despite a heavy air and artillery bombardment, when the assault battalions entered the city, they found its defences largely intact. Although not heavily fortified prior to the battle, its garrison had spent the last month turning every building and cellar into a pillbox or fighting position. The fighting in Aachen was a typically grim example of urban combat. With so many fortified buildings, the battle devolved to the company and platoon. For example, Colonel Daniel's 2nd Battalion divided its forces into platoon-sized tank infantry teams. Each infantry platoon was allocated a medium tank or tank destroyer, and each was tasked with clearing a specific building. The tank infantry tactics employed were typical of American doctrine. The tank would pour sustained fire into any building that was suspected of putting up resistance, allowing the infantry to flank the position and clear it with grenades. This approach was slow and careful, but effective. However, the sewers beneath the city proved to be a persistent problem. Bypassed German rifle sections would often appear in the rear of assault platoons, executing deadly ambushes. In a particularly grisly operation, these had to be cleared with flamethrowers. Despite the sustained attack, several positions were so stout and resolutely held that self-propelled 155mm howitzers were brought up to level the buildings with direct fire. By these methods, the 1st Infantry slowly reduced the city, reaching Colonel Wilk's headquarters on the 21st. They were about to level the building with close-range 155mm fire when a pair of captured American engineers emerged waving white flags and carrying Wilk's written offer of surrender. The Battle of Aachen was over, and although it had been a clear American victory, the tenacious German defense had cost the Allies dearly in time, men, and materiel. In over a month of fighting, the 30th Division alone lost approximately 3,000 men, with another 2,000 casualties incurred by the 1st Infantry. In total, the 1st US Army suffered nearly 20,000 casualties in the month of October. German losses were even more severe. 11,637 German prisoners were taken during the battle, and approximately another 5,000 were either killed or missing. The city itself was now a shattered ruin that reeked of death, its streets littered with broken glass, destroyed vehicles, dead bodies, and rubble. By fighting this hopeless battle, von Rundstedt and Modell had bought precious time. During the month of bitter combat, the Germans had been at work developing a new line to the east. This defensive belt followed a line of natural obstacles that ran through the Hurtgen forest to a series of coal mines around the town of Stolberg, where it rejoined the west wall proper at Geilenkirchen. It would be here, in the dark depths of the Hurtgen forest, a nearly impassable natural wilderness, that the United States Army would face some of the most bitter combat of the Second World War. If one were to gaze east from the small border towns to the southeast of Aachen, before you stretches the vast green blanket of the Hurtgen forest. Along with the Eifel National Park, the Hurtgenwald is one of Germany's great woodlands. The wilderness area, which also crosses into Belgium, is approximately 30 kilometers wide and 20 kilometers deep. Most of the Hurtgen forest is untouched wilderness, with very few roads or trails. The Hurtgen is a man-made woodland, and thus is particularly dense, with trees so closely packed that hardly any sunlight reaches the forest floor. Like many forests in the developed world, this area is mountainous. Although not especially high, the region is crisscrossed by steep ridges and deep valleys. In the center of this remote area sits the Hurtgen Plateau, which contains the only major developed centers, the small villages of Hurtgen, Schmidt, and Vossenack. These contain the only developed roads and are thus the most militarily significant features in the region. Finally, to the immediate east of the village of Schmidt is the massive Schwarmenauer Dam, the single largest of the Rohr structures. The dam has a capacity of 203.2 million cubic meters of water. Undeniably, the dam itself was the most strategically significant feature in the wider region. In September, the 60th Infantry Regiment, an element of General Craig's 9th Division, had already entered the Hurtgen. They had returned bloody and bruised. Despite their weakness, the German defenders were able to use the excellent defensive terrain to their advantage, and the 9th Infantry Division had essentially been stopped cold. As the First Army began preparing for its attack on Aachen, its commander, General Hurtgen, now had to contend with the sprawling wilderness which stood between him and the Rohr River. The Hurtgen forest was hardly ideal terrain for a large mechanized offensive, but, in General Hurtgen's estimation, it could simply not be ignored. The most straightforward plan for the First Army was to just bypass this feature. They could certainly drive through Aachen and make a right hook, enveloping the Hurtgenwald and taking the Rohr dams from the rear. This would obviously avoid engaging the Germans in such ideal defensive terrain, but neither General Hurtgen nor the 7th Corps commander, General Joseph Lawton Collins, were well disposed to this idea. Collins had served in the 1918 Meuse-Argonne offensive, and just as the Argonne forest had served as a perfect area for the concentration of enemy forces which would threaten the American left flank, so the Hurtgen forest seemed to offer the Germans the same opportunity to threaten 7 Corps' right. If it were bypassed, with such thick country it would be very difficult to detect or disrupt the concentration of German reserves, and the Aachen salient, which would have been produced by bypassing the forest, would be a prime target for a counterattack. Thus, and despite the difficulties of the terrain, it was decided that, along with the Aachen offensive, a supporting attack had to be made in the Hurtgen forest. Despite the operational significance of the Schwarmenauer and Uft dams, these were not the primary objective of the 9th Division's October attack. This was, in effect, a supporting operation to the Aachen offensive designed to protect the right flank of the 7th Corps. Therefore, the primary objective was not to clear the forest, but to simply deny it to the Germans. One of the defining features of the Hurtgenwald is its lack of communications. The entire area is almost devoid of major roads or rail lines. What few roads there are converge on the villages of Schmidt and Vossenack, which are separated by the deep ravine of the Raschelsbach-Kohl River. Therefore, if these small towns could be taken, particularly Schmidt with its road nexus, the Wehrmacht would struggle to effectively use the Hurtgen forest as a staging area for a large-scale counterattack on Aachen. Or, at least, so the thinking went in First Army headquarters. The task for taking Schmidt was left to General Lewis A. Craig's 9th Infantry Division. Like much of the Allied armies which had just completed such a rapid and long advance, in September, the 9th Division found itself stretched thin. When the first attack had been made, which was in fact more of a reconnaissance in force, its divisional front ran for almost 20 miles. Thus, Craig had simply not been able to achieve sufficient concentration to make any headway. A month later, things had improved, but the line was still 9 miles long, and one of the division's 3 infantry regiments, the 47th, had to remain on the defensive and cover the line at Schevenhut. This left only 2 regimental combat teams, the 39th and 60th Infantry, available for the Schmidt attack. Even this limited concentration required large sections of the front to be held by engineers and other support units. Consequently, the main hopes for the October attack's prospects lay not in overwhelming American strength, but supposed German weakness. In the estimation of the 9th Division's intelligence officer, Major Hurtgen, the German opposition across the division's entire 9-mile front amounted to no more than 5,000 men, composing 14 separate fortress and replacement battalions. These disparate infantry battalions had no meaningful brigade or regimental organisation, and were only loosely affiliated under an understaffed divisional headquarters, making a coordinated defence difficult. Hurtgen evaluated German leadership as excellent, but noted that morale was characteristically low. In essence, American intelligence assessments were highly accurate, but what they failed to appreciate was that with defensive terrain this formidable and a pre-prepared defensive line to man, higher level organisation and even morale might not have the same effect on the battle as one would typically expect. Manning the Hurtgen forest defences were the battered remnants of 2 infantry divisions, the 353rd and 275th. In September, the former represented little more than a divisional headquarters, and on October the 4th it was merged with the more robust 275th. Under the command of General Hans Schmidt, the 275th Infantry Division had seen heavy combat in Normandy, which led to its almost complete destruction in the Falaise pocket. The absorption of the 353rd Division did little to rectify the vast losses it had already suffered. To meet the American attack on the town that shared his name, General Schmidt deployed a frontline combat strength of 5,000 infantry, with a further 1,500 men constituting his headquarters and support elements. Just as American intelligence had predicted, the 275th Division's regimental organization was, at best, patchy. In the northern sector of the Hurtgen forest was the 275th Division's organic 984th Regiment. Holding the centre of the line was a hodgepodge of battalions inherited from the 353rd Division, which were now nominally grouped to form the 985th Infantry Regiment. The southern sector of the front, facing the 9th Division's primary axis of attack, was another former component of the 353rd Division, which was labelled the 253rd Regiment. In the last two cases, these formations were practically regiments in name alone. General Schmidt did have a divisional reserve, the 275th Fusilier Battalion, and a replacement battalion numbering 400 and 200 men respectively. The 275th Division's artillery amounted to just 13 105mm howitzers and one 210mm heavy field gun. For armoured support, Schmidt deployed a mere 6 assault guns. Other than man-portable anti-armour weapons such as the Panzerschreck and Panzerfaust, the 6 Stugs were the only anti-tank weapons available to the entire division. Much like his American opponents, General Schmidt did not place much significance on the Roer dams. He viewed his primary objective as keeping the Americans confined to the Hurtgen forest itself in order to prevent them from gaining access to the opened high ground along the Roer River. Thus, the primary terrain to be dominated was the Hurtgen-Kleinhauer road network. General Craig's plan of attack included 3 phases. Following an axis of attack that drove due east, the 6 battalions of his 2 regiments were to attack in line abreast across a 4-kilometre front. Their first objective was to clear a line of west wall pillboxes in some extremely thick woodland, directly to the west of the villages of Germeter and Vossenack. In places, this wooded country was only a few thousand metres wide, but it did contain many of the pre-war west wall bunkers in the area. Once this forested zone had been captured, the attacking regiments would reach a cleared area surrounding Vossenack. After securing the village, the third phase objective was the town of Schmidt and its all-important road junction, about 4 kilometres to the southeast. The 60th and 39th Regiments were heavily supported. Providing artillery support were the 9th Division's organic artillery units, 3 105 and 1 heavy 155mm battalions, each of which deployed 3 4-gun batteries, and a further 3 1/3 artillery battalions allocated to the division by Corps headquarters. Armoured support was provided by the 746th Independent Tank Battalion, with its 3 medium and 1 light tank companies, and elements of a tank destroyer battalion. Finally, the attack would receive substantial tactical air support, including 7 squadrons of fighter bombers from the 9th Tactical Air Command. Although not a bad plan, Craig's concept did have some limitations. Other than the terrain he was facing, by attacking on an east-west axis, he would leave his left wing vulnerable to a counterattack from the village of Hurtgen. Making this weakness worse was the lack of any meaningful divisional reserve, probably a single battalion of the 60th Regiment. But despite these challenges, Craig was confident that if a major breakthrough of the West Wall could be achieved, the Germans would withdraw back to the Rhine. The attack was scheduled to begin on the 5th of October, but cloud and rain prevented the opening airstrike. Rescheduled for dawn on the 6th, the attack was again delayed by low cloud over the airfields. Finally, shortly after 10 a.m, the roar of thunderbolts could be heard through the thick forest canopy. 84 P-47s screamed in, striking the primary German concentrations with bombs and rockets. As these departed, a heavy artillery barrage pummeled the line, rapidly switching between various target aiming points. For over an hour, the airmen and gunners took turns battering the German position, with alternating 5-minute periods of air and artillery attack. Finally, at 11:30, the maelstrom abated and the men left their foxholes. The 9th Division's first objective was a clearing just over a kilometre to the east. Certainly not far for soldiers who had driven the Germans all the way from Normandy. But as they advanced into the dark, foreboding forest, a green hell awaited them. Within moments, the German outpost line responded, engulfing the forward elements in a hailstorm of machine gun fire. Although comparatively few in number, in this sector the west wall pillboxes were very well camouflaged, and it was so dark on the forest floor that the attack may as well have been made at night. In the centre of the line, the 60th Regiment's 2nd Battalion was stopped cold by the outpost line before the primary defensive belt. Despite the ferocious bombardment, these bunkers were all intact, and as the troopers of the 60th advanced, the pillboxes met them with a lethal rain of fire, the terrifying sound of the MG-42 immediately sending whole companies to ground. It would take the battalion nearly a week to clear this outpost line. On the left flank, the 39th Infantry had a little more success, pushing back the outposts. However, as they advanced, they encountered increasingly heavy and accurate fire from a line of bunkers on the other side of the Weisse Valley. The fighting here was so costly that one company of the 2nd Battalion, which was engaged along the Weisse, ended the first day of battle with 2 officers and 60 men, a little more than a platoon. As the assault companies tried to flank each pillbox, many were decimated by German artillery. Despite only having 14 howitzers available to aid in the defence, the German gunners were greatly aided by the terrain. The Hurtgen forest is so thick that it was almost impossible for a diving shell to actually reach the ground. Virtually all of them exploded in the trees. Air-bursting artillery fire is particularly devastating to infantry, especially those who are exposed and manoeuvring. When a shell detonates just above the ground, a much larger area is subjected to the fragmentation pattern. Additionally, it is much more difficult to take cover from an airburst compared to a ground-level detonation. Thus, despite having so few guns in comparison to the Americans, with every 105mm artillery shell airbursting above the advancing infantrymen, casualties were severe. Although it was not engaged by any small arms fire during the first day, one battalion lost over 100 men to shell bursts in the trees above them on that day alone. Although the artillery support was meagre, German Fortress, Volksgrenadier and Reserve battalions did have an ample allotment of 8cm mortars, which greatly added to this carnage. To the infantry company, the mortar is its own organic artillery, and the Germans were not short of these deadly weapons. It soon became clear that fighting in the Hurtgen forest required a new set of tactics and standard operating procedures. Airbursting artillery made the traditional foxhole practically useless, unless it was fortified with overhead cover such as logs and earth. If caught in the open, the men were ordered not to lay down on the ground, but curl up into a ball at the base of a tree, leaving the smallest possible surface area exposed. The amplification of artillery's lethality was far less acute for the Germans. Despite having just 1/10 of the supporting artillery fires, the German infantry enjoyed the protection of steel and concrete. Many Germans sat safe in their bunkers whilst their American opponents had to face the maelstrom without cover. The forest also aided the defence in other important ways. It was far too thick to allow for the deployment of medium tanks. The sappers tried desperately to clear trails so the supporting arms could be brought forward, but this was painfully slow work. Furthermore, both regiments only had a single fire trail to act as their primary line of communication. And as the small but steady German shell fire began to target these avenues, they became blocked with fallen trees and bogged vehicles. Thus, the GIs of the 9th Division had to take on this formidable bunker line without the armoured support or other direct fire weapons they would typically rely upon. The two sides were also so closely interlocked, with lead elements interspersed with the German outpost or bunker line, that the formidable indirect fires available could not be brought to bear on the most stubborn defensive positions. Thus, despite expending an average of 5,000 rounds of artillery per day, the indirect fire support could not provide much aid to the assault battalions. Consequently, throughout the first few days of the offensive, it rapidly devolved into a slow, plodding, unsupported infantry attack, where every yard gained was paid for in gallons of American blood. Despite the fierce and stubborn resistance, some headway was made on the second day of the battle. In two separate areas, small gaps were found between bunkers, and 2 infantry companies were able to penetrate the pillbox line and reach the cleared ground overlooking the villages of Reichelskorl and Germeter. They had reached their first phase objective, But neither Colonel Thompson nor Colonel Chatfield had any desire to continue the advance into the clear, open ground without armoured support. Thus, the two formations dug in and waited for the sappers to clear the trails and fire breaks wide enough to allow the supporting armour to move forward. This task was greatly complicated by the still extant German bunker line in the rear. Contrary to expectation, even with small penetrations of the line, the Germans were not abandoning the west wall. In fact, despite their material inferiority, the motley crew of children, convalescents and old men were fighting hard, aided in their struggle by Forrest and Bunker. The German commander, General Schmidt, was surprised that the Americans had chosen to attack in extensive, thick and nearly trackless forest terrain. But despite this unforeseen attack, he was not slow to react. Schmidt quickly mobilized his divisional reserve, the 275th Fusilier Battalion, and just as the Americans expected, had committed it against the left wing of the 39th Infantry Regiment. But when the Germans went over to the attack, all of their defensive advantages were lost. As soon as contact was made with the Fusiliers, their counterattack was brought to a rapid and bloody halt by the massed artillery fires of the division. On the 8th of October, General Schmidt launched another counterattack, this time by the 275th Division Engineers and 600 men of the 983rd Regiment. Now it was the Germans' turn to experience the shocking impact of hundreds of 105mm artillery shells airbursting in the trees above them. Both attacks fell back in bloody disorder. Notwithstanding the meagre resources available in the Hurtgen forest, General Schmidt's defenders were still holding the 9th Division firm. On the 8th of October, the Americans noticed a considerable increase in the volume of incoming artillery fire. General Strobe, the 74th Corps commander, had deployed an artillery battery from the neighbouring 89th Division, in addition to supporting fire from the Volksartillerie Corps, an artillery brigade attached to the 7th Army headquarters. This more than doubled the amount of available artillery fires supporting the defence. As useful as the additional artillery tubes were, in terms of infantry units the help was minimal. The 7th Army commander, General Brandenberger, provided meagre assistance in the form of 2 fortress infantry battalions, both of which incurred crippling losses the day they were committed to battle. For both sides, the Hurtgen forest was quickly becoming a meat grinder, where machine gun and air-bursting artillery consumed men in their hundreds. As the battle reached its third day, the 275th Division was continuing to hold a cohesive line along a clearing to the east of Goemeta, preventing a breakout into the more open country beyond, but they were completely out of reserves. Things were getting so desperate that on the 9th of October, 2 companies of overage policemen from Düren were deployed into the line near Wittscheid. The German situation deteriorated further on the 9th. That day, American sappers were able to finally push through a fire break large enough to bring forward armour. With both attacking regiments now able to actually employ combined arms tactics, the German defences began to crumble. In the centre of the line, at Reichskall, Colonel Chatfield's battalion attacked in a wedge formation behind a platoon of M4 Sherman tanks. This attack progressed so rapidly that the German line was overrun. When a lieutenant rose from his foxhole to engage the tanks with a Panzerfaust, he was literally cut in half by a 75mm shell. After witnessing that horrific sight, his men, almost 100 of them, surrendered. Clearly, the lack of anti-tank artillery and armoured support was a critical German weakness. By October the 10th, both regiments had gained the tree line, running along the open ground near Goemeta. The path to Vossenack seemed to lay wide open. But the 9th Division's communications were still very insecure. In many areas to their rear, there were intact pillboxes, and supply parties were being routinely ambushed by German patrols and snipers. To the men overlooking the open ground, their newly won position seemed to be very insecure indeed. Despite these setbacks, forward patrols found the village of Goemeta abandoned. The Germans had withdrawn, and the first phase objective had been secured. From the attack start line west of the Visave Valley to the first clearing and the village of Goemeta, an advance of perhaps 1,500 metres, had taken almost a week and cost the 9th Division's 2 regiments almost 1,000 men, killed, wounded or missing. Before any advance could be made on Vossenack, General Craig was determined to make his hold on Goemeta more secure. The 60th Regiment's 3rd Battalion was ordered back into the forest with the objective of clearing a bunker network on the right flank and taking a road junction which would be essential in improving the regiment's communications. Although the attack began in the same grim fashion as the previous 6 days of fighting, after a lead company cleared a German pillbox, the assault gained momentum. The defensive fire seemed to slacken, and groups of enemies started surrendering. Within 3 hours, the whole area had been secured, including the road junction and surrounding high ground. The men of the 60th Infantry were ecstatic at this progress, until prisoners started to report that they had not received reinforcement in a week and had not eaten in 3 days. Perhaps this was not a sign of the general collapse the men were hoping for. With this area cleared, the 9th Division was able to move forward a number of tanks and tank destroyers. However, this complicated the tenuous supply position. Additionally, the forward battalion still had exposed flanks, and all of the division's reserves had been committed. In fact, elements of the 2nd Battalion were still trying to reduce a German position they had encountered on the first day of the battle. This vulnerability was exposed that afternoon, when a German company maneuvered around the right flank and attacked behind the frontline positions. This penetration was contained, but combat with this force continued all day. As the 60th Regiment attempted to clear the forest and the flanks, the 39th Infantry Regiment was ordered to continue the advance to Vosseneck and then Schmidt, the attack's ultimate objective. This, it was hoped, would be much more of a conventional combined arms attack across open country, one that might be executed quickly. A number of Shermans and M10 tank destroyers had arrived and would accompany the infantry. Despite the hopes of regimental command, the 39th's attack on Vosseneck began inauspiciously. As soon as the tanks departed the cover of the forest, they were engaged by heavy and accurate assault gun fire. The Stug 3G was a development of the early war Panzer III medium tank. In order to fit a larger caliber weapon, the turret was removed, and the long-barreled 7.5cm KWK-40 gun, essentially the same weapon as the ubiquitous PaK-40 7.5cm anti-tank gun, was mounted in the hull, transforming a tank into an assault gun. This weapon revolutionized what had been the anemic Panzer III, giving the Stug the ability to destroy any Allied tank at tactically significant ranges. This weapon allowed the Stug to act as both an assault gun, providing direct fire support to dismounted infantry against targets like bunkers or buildings, or as a tank destroyer. The lack of a turret meant that, other than a reasonably small amount of traverse, laying the gun meant moving the tank. However, in a defensive engagement, this was a minor inconvenience, as an assault gun could be pre-positioned to cover a specific lane of fire. Furthermore, the lack of a turret gave the vehicle a low profile, making the Stug easy to camouflage and hard to hit. The vehicle showed all of these virtues at Vosseneck. Despite only having 6 assault guns operational in the whole Hurtgen forest, this small number effectively stopped the 39th's attack in its tracks. As soon as it left the cover of the tree line, its supporting Shermans were engaged by these unseen Stugs, destroying several vehicles and damaging others with accurate, long-range 75mm fire. The infantry, now without tank support, also fell back, and by midday it was clear that the attack had faltered. Seeing the destruction of the division's supporting tanks, a single battalion under Colonel Stumpf began looking for other, less well-defended paths. Keeping to the thick woodland and skirting open ground, Stumpf's battalion was able to execute a long left hook. They advanced over a kilometre without meeting any resistance. That evening, he was able to report to division headquarters that his lead company was now within a few hundred yards of the town and was poised to envelop it. Despite the promise of this attack, the 9th Division commander, General Craig, was apprehensive. This lone battalion was now thinly stretched, and even if its attack was successful, all the Germans would have to do to counter it was hold the village and dispatch a force to cut Stumpf's communications. Therefore, he ordered Stumpf to dig in and wait for the 12th, when a 2nd battalion would be in position to assault Vosseneck from the east, allowing for a 2-battalion attack. It was clear to all by the 11th of October that, despite the small but significant progress that had been made by the 9th Division, it was becoming increasingly vulnerable to a counterattack. Its battalions were now exhausted and badly depleted from a week of bitter forest fighting. Its communications were tenuous, and supplying its forward battalions through the forest was a tough and persistent challenge. As the attack progressed, the exposed left flank only grew longer, and the 39th Regiment's battalions were now strung out along the Vosseneck Ridge. Luckily, to this point in the battle, the Germans were so depleted that they had no reserves available to exploit these vulnerabilities. But that all changed on the 11th of October. That day, General Schmidt received a number of distinguished guests at his forward headquarters, the Army and Corps commanders, Generals Brandenberger and Straub, who informed the division commander that he would have a fresh regiment to conduct a large-scale counterattack on the 12th. He was ordered to strike the left wing of the new salient with all possible vigour. During the night of the 11th of October, 2,000 men of Regiment Wegerlein were driven north, leaving their prior positions along the Luxembourg border. Commanded by a colonel from whom the regiment drew its name, the formation was well equipped and armed, with a large allocation of machine guns and heavy and medium mortars. The men were also of good quality, about half of them officer candidates. Given the state of the Wehrmacht in October 1944, this was as good a unit as General Schmidt could have realistically hoped for. Colonel Wegerlein duly deployed his battalions on the wooded plateau between the Weisse Way and the Germater Hurtgen road, facing the 9th Division's exposed left flank. His attack began at 7 o'clock on the morning of the 12th of October. His objective, Reichelscall, first appeared to be within easy reach. After a brief artillery bombardment, the Germans left their start line. The 39th Infantry Regiment's positions here were thinly held, and Wegerlein's men were able to easily envelop its left-wing battalion. Overrunning a roadblock manned by engineers, the counterattack was able to achieve a breakthrough, and the lead elements quickly cut the track that served as the 39th Regiment's main line of supply and communication. Regiment Wegerlein was now right in the heart of the 9th Division's position. General Craig, on the orders of his superiors, had made the mistake of trying to achieve too much with too little, and had thus been forced to commit all of his available forces on the drive to Vossenac. He had the most meagre of divisional reserves to meet this new and highly dangerous threat: a few engineers, some of the divisional reconnaissance troop, and a platoon of light tanks. The reconnaissance troop commander had already moved his unit to cover the 39th Infantry's exposed left flank, but this left Craig with literally nothing else to deploy. The situation appeared dire for the 9th Division. Their positions had been enveloped by a flank attack, and a fresh German regiment was now behind their exposed left wing. There appeared to be little stopping Regiment Wegerlein from reaching Reichelscall and cutting off both forward regiments. But, inexplicably, after taking the 39th Regiment's primary line of supply and encountering only meagre resistance, the Germans stopped. They advanced no further than this position. Interviews with prisoners later indicated that a lack of initiative shown by the battalion commanders, combined with faulty communications such as field telephones, which were also badly disrupted by American artillery fire, generated a state of confusion and paralysis within the regiment after this first phase objective had been reached. It was clear that both sides found the Hurtgen forest to be a very confusing environment. For the Americans, this delay in Regiment Wegerlein's attack was a godsend. By midday, the regimental commander, Colonel Bond, ordered Colonel Stump to withdraw his largely intact battalion from the Vossenac area and redeploy his units to attack the German penetration from the east, Colonel Wegerlein's left flank. In a well-executed night movement, Stump redeployed his battalion, which was ready for the attack on the morning of the 13th of October. To the south, the 60th Regiment was attempting to widen the division's penetration when it was attacked by an understrength battalion. Approximately 300 men strong, this force was clearly attempting to act in concert with Regiment Wegerlein. Confined to the few roads in the area, which were now all firmly in American hands, and with significant American forces which had been redeployed to the right flank, this attack was doomed to failure. But nevertheless, a nasty firefight soon developed to the south of Reichelscall. Although the counterattack was defeated, the confused and costly battle compelled the battalion to spend the rest of the day reorganizing. General Schmidt had intended Regiment Wegerlein to continue the attack on the 13th, but that morning he received orders from Corps headquarters that all of the regiment's officer candidates had to be withdrawn from the front. This literally represented half of Wegerlein's infantry strength. In addition to the 500 casualties he had already sustained, the loss of these men spelled the end of a counterattack that had, for a brief moment, appeared to be turning the battle. By midday on the 13th, the 39th Regiment had redeployed a number of infantry companies containing Regiment Wegerlein's penetration, much of which was Colonel Stump's battalion. With these forces now in place, Colonel Bond turned his attention to driving back the incursion. It took 3 days of hard, close-range combat to regain the positions which had been lost on the 11th, an attack which required not only the commitment of practically all of the division's reserves, but much of the supporting artillery as well. Until the remnants of Regiment Wegerlein had been driven back, no further advance on Vosseneck could be realistically contemplated. The fact that it took 3 days to regain the left flank's original positions and push back a German regiment that was, at that time, present in much less than battalion strength was a sign of just how depleted the 9th Division had become. It had been consumed by 10 days of hard fighting in the Hurtgen forest, one of the worst meat grinders of the war. Any unit, no matter how fresh or well equipped, would emerge from that kind of engagement spent. Much of the division's companies were at half strength or below, and the men who were still at the front, many of which were wide-eyed green replacements, were suffering the effects of such a vicious fight. Tragically, Colonel Wegeline was amongst those who had fallen. As he inspected Company E's perimeter, one of its non-commissioned officers shot him, killing his own colonel. But it was now clear that the 9th Division's attack had culminated, and the badly depleted unit had to be relieved. It had fallen far short of its ultimate objective, Schmidt. In nearly 2 weeks of fighting, the 9th Division had gained about 3,000 metres of the Hurtgen forest, and in doing so had suffered more than 1 casualty per yard. When it left the line, the 9th Division had lost over 4,500 men, killed, wounded, or missing. The paper strength of an American infantry division in 1944 was 14,253 officers and ranks, not counting attached units such as independent tank battalions. In that short time, the Hurtgen forest had consumed the equivalent of an entire infantry regiment. For their part, the Germans suffered approximately 3,000 casualties, including 1,300 captured. A very small part of the west wall had been breached, but the German defensive line was still intact. If the wider operational and strategic objectives which had been decided upon by Eisenhower, Bradley, and Hodges were to be achieved, then the attack on Schmidt had to be resumed. With the Battle of Aachen over, the responsibility for the main drive to the Rhine now fell upon the 7th Corps. Not wanting to have its energy, attention, and resources divided, General Hodges redeployed the First Army. The intercorps boundary was moved north, thus transferring all responsibility for the Schmidt sector to the neighbouring 5th Corps, freeing up the 7th to drive through the Aachen Gap. The 9th Division would be relieved by the recently rested 28th. It would now be up to the men of the Keystone Division, veterans of Operation Cobra, to take Schmidt. Soon, they would take their turn in the Hurtgen meat grinder. We can only characterize the first act of the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest as a German defensive victory. Yes, the west wall had been penetrated across a front of perhaps 4 kilometers, but the Americans had not taken the critical road junction at Schmidt, and their attack had been contained at Vosseneck. The line had not been breached, and the 9th Division had been badly torn up in the attempt. How can the failure of the 9th Division's October attack in the Hurtgen Forest be explained, especially considering just how weak the German forces opposing them were? To understand why the German defense was so effective, we first need to appreciate what made the Western Allies so formidable in 1944, and why that changed in the dark depths of the Hurtgenwald. Perhaps the most widespread conception of the war on the Western Front is that Allied material superiority is the simple answer to Western victory. Certainly, Anglo-American industrial might, backed up by access to global resources, was a critical element in Allied strength. However, the way this advantage manifested was not simply through the Allies' ability to lose more tanks or aircraft in a straightforward battle of attrition. The most important consequence of their wealth was how it allowed the American and British armies to fight. Combined arms operations were absolutely foundational to Allied doctrine, and perhaps nowhere was this more evident than in the American army. In the last 2 years of the war, across any theatre, wherever American infantry went into battle, they did so with the aid of all of the supporting arms. The tank, infantry, artillery team was absolutely foundational to the American way of war, and it was this combination of arms that made them so formidable. With the possible exception of the Tommy, no infantrymen went into battle better supported than the GI. Practically every infantry attack went in behind the tanks, and the supporting artillery fire was not only prodigious, it was deeply integrated with the frontline units. Even in the depths of the Hurtgen forest, the Germans were impressed by the American artillery, not only its fearsome firepower, but how rapidly and accurately it switched between targets, and this integration was facilitated by both excellent communications and airborne artillery observation. Furthermore, the addition of air power to the tank infantry artillery team only made it all the more capable, substantially increasing its firepower, while simultaneously limiting enemy mobility. All of these supporting assets, which included complete motorization, acted as force multipliers, greatly increasing the speed, lethality, and general level of combat power an American infantry regiment could generate, far more than their German opponents, who often had to rely upon their own organic weapons. Obviously, the Wehrmacht emphasized combined arms operations as well, but they never had the resources to fully actualize the potential of these new systems and doctrine. Most famously, early in the war, the Germans concentrated their armored fighting vehicles into panzer divisions, highly lethal and mobile formations that were the spearhead of offensive operations, and the primary reserve when fighting a defensive. The Allies followed this pattern, creating armored divisions themselves. However, with the industrial might of the United States behind them, the Western Allies were able to apply the principle of combined arms across the entire force. Although American infantry divisions had no organic armor, in practice they were almost always allocated an independent tank battalion, each one of which had a paper strength of 53 medium and 17 light tanks, 70 in all. For example, the 746th Tank Battalion was attached to the 9th Infantry Division for almost the entire war. For many operations, an infantry division would also be allocated a Tank Destroyer Battalion, a formation that would, at full strength, field some 36 M10 tank destroyers, vehicles that were later replaced by the more capable M38 Hellcat or 90mm armed M36. Consequently, it was typical in 1944 for an American infantry division, with its attached independent tank and tank destroyer battalions, to enter battle with over 100 armoured fighting vehicles, almost two-thirds the tank strength of a late-war panzer division. It was also just as mobile, with a huge allocation of heavy road vehicles such as trucks. Unlike their German opponents, you would not find a single horse allocated to an American infantry division. Although the Wehrmacht aimed to supplement its infantry divisions with assault gun battalions in an analogous fashion, they simply never had the resources to effectively do so. Instead, they aimed to enhance the combat power their infantry units could generate by improving their organic firepower, through the development of weapons such as the MG42 and STG44. It was this larger system of force multipliers that made the US Army of 1944 so capable. Now, with this wider context firmly in view, it's not hard to see why the 9th Division performed so badly in the Hurtgen Forest. The terrain itself deprived the 9th Division of many of these supporting assets and capabilities. The forest was so thick that armour could not be effectively employed, and despite their overwhelming advantage in the amount of indirect fire available, the combination of tree-induced airburst and concrete bunkers gave the outnumbered Germans the artillery advantage. Despite its awesome capability, the excellent American artillery and air support could not even locate the primary German positions, let alone bring accurate fire to bear upon them. Thus, the infantry had to try and penetrate a well-prepared defensive line unsupported. Just as occurred 30 years before across the countless battlefields of the Great War, this led to an attack in which thousands of lives were destroyed for meagre gains indeed. Moreover, at the small unit level, the Americans were now having to face an opponent who had an advantage in organic firepower. It was the forest itself that not only deprived the 9th Division of its typical advantages, but compelled it to abandon the American way of war. Given the tactical implications of an operation in such terrain, one has to question the wisdom of deciding to fight this battle in the first place. But nonetheless, the decision had been made. General Hodges had decreed that the Wehrmacht was going to be driven from the Hurtgenwald, one way or the other, a course that the October setback had only hardened. In fact, the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest had only just begun.